Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So today I thought I would do some paint making, as it's been a little while since I've shown you my process by making paints. We're going to be looking at two pigments today. This is the Manganese Blue Genuine PB33 and Quinacridone Gold Genuine PO49. You can see me playing with the jar there of Manganese Blue, and as you saw from the price tag, it's a very expensive pigment at £49.50 for just this small little jar. So yeah, it's very expensive, which is why the cost of the final product is also pretty expensive. And this is genuine Manganese Blue PB33. You can no longer get this paint from commercial paint brands, same as the PO49. I believe it's been quite a few years since either have been available from a commercial source. And here are some of the tools that I'm going to be using today to make the paint. So you've just got a palette knife, a paint roller, which is the thing you can see there. I've got a very fancy decorative one. You can get cheap ones that are not decorative. I'll leave a video up in the iCards where I talk about this fancy muller and where I got it from, because it is a real nice luxury that I've got. And as well, obviously some measuring spoons, and then there my paint binder. Now there has been some controversy over my paint binder in a previous video I did a few years ago. Basically my paint binder is my own recipe. I don't really feel comfortable sharing it because paint binders can be fickle things, and what works for me here in the UK is not going to work for everybody, so I feel it's best just not to share the formula. But I will say that it's 100% vegan, so anybody can use my paints. I'm just going to weigh the pigment out here. You can see I'm just measuring it out into a spoon. Personally, I found it best to go by volume rather than actual weight, just because different pigments have different pigment densities. i.e. 1 tablespoon of manganese blue, say, weighs this amount. The same tablespoon of a much heavier pigment could weigh a lot more, and I don't find it's very accurate to go off weight. It's just from my personal experience. Every paint maker, of course, has their own way of doing things, measuring, mixing, etc. So if you've heard somebody else say different, it very well may work for them, but it doesn't work for me. So I'm just going to ask you to keep that in mind. So I'm just putting the pigment here onto a glass chopping board. This one that I got a few years ago, it's pretty cheap. I got it off Amazon, and over time it's sort of roughed up, which is helpful for grinding pigments. And this is what we're going to mix the pigment on with the paint binder, and we're going to grind it up with the muller to get a nice smooth paint. Now I have seen videos from some people that don't mould them and they just mix them with a palette knife. I really wouldn't recommend doing this. The paint muller really does grind down the pigment and really emulsify it with the binder, and that's really important because you want a nicely blended paint. Obviously we're doing this by hand, so it's not going to be super fine ground. So there are some paints, particularly ones that I do sell, which do have still like a texture to them where we're not able to fully grind down the pigment. Ones that kind of spring to mind tend to be like in Danbartist and Blue PB60, that can kind of have a texture look to it. You don't see any difference in when using it, so you can use it and there'll be no like lumps in it, but it does sort of look a bit bumpy sometimes when it dries, just because we can grind it that finely by hand. You have to remember that commercial brands such as Winsor & Newton, Schminker, etc. will use machines that can really, really finely grind these particles down and get the smoothest of paints. I am going to as well point out some paint making safety just here. So it's always really important to wear a mask when you've got loose pigment powder like this. You don't want to be breathing in any dust or particles, particularly if it's a pigment like a manganese pigment that is toxic. You don't want to be breathing those particles in. Once all the dry powder has been mixed into the binder, like we're nearly reaching at this stage now, you can take the mask off because there's no loose pigment powder anywhere, so you're not going to get anything breathing in, which is important. I would say that the loose powder is probably the most dangerous part of the process. Once it's all mixed in, there's not really as much danger, so you should be fine. But as always, take precautions, don't take risks, make sure you're in a good room with good ventilation, there are no pets or small children around that can get in the way or cause problems. And once the pigment powder is all mixed in with the binder, we can switch over to the paint muller and start mulling. It is quite a repetitive process. You basically just drag the paint muller across the board and it'll grind up the pigments. I tend to like to do this in circular motions or zigzag motions just to try and get as much of the mixture as I can and grind it as finely as I can. This can also take varying amounts of times depending on the pigment. Smooth pigments like this you can probably find mulling for about half an hour to 45 minutes probably will give you a good paint. Some pigments are a bit chunkier or a bit grittier, you're probably going to be looking at an hour. I think the longest one I've had is nearly 2 hours, so it does vary on the pigment. So it's best just to experiment and see how it turns out. But I would definitely recommend at least sort of half an hour paint mulling just to really get a nicely finely ground pigment. And as well, the longer you mull it, the longer that it's going to be on the board for, and more of the liquid will evaporate, giving you a thicker mixture, which can be a bit easier to control because obviously it's very runny at this stage and you can have accidents, and it also makes for more messy pan pouring, so a thicker paint mixture is definitely more helpful. I'm just going to show you some of the mulling process because it can be pretty repetitive and pretty boring just to watch a paint muller being dragged around a board. So we're going to speed it up and I'm just going to show you a small part of it, and then we're going to move on to the Quinacridone Gold Genuine. Right, so the manganese blue is all done now. I've cleaned up and got a fresh board, and we're going to look at Quinacridone Gold Genuine. So this is a bit different because this pigment actually comes as a dispersion. This means the paint is in liquid form, so it does minimise risk because we don't have loose pigment. So you don't have to worry about mask with this pigment because there's no loose powder, which is always a nice bonus. However, I find the downside with a dispersion is it's a bit harder to judge the binder to pigment ratio because it's mixed in as a liquid. So you kind of have to play it by ear. And yeah, I also find it takes a tiny bit longer to mould because you're having to wait for some of that liquid to evaporate to judge how much binder you need. So I kind of start off with low binder to pigment quantity. There is a recommendation on the jar which I also followed a little bit as well, and then I just mould it until I notice it getting thicker and thicker, and then adding more pigment as adding more paint binder as I need. So that's sort of what I recommend as well if you're going to get a dispersion. Not all pigment manufacturers offer a dispersion, so it depends on which one you go for. But they're both pigments are from different manufacturers. The manganese blue is from Cornelison's here in the UK, and the PO49 Quinacridone Gold is from Guerrero Pigment, which is based in the USA. Personally, I find a lot of paint making is very experimental. You kind of have to play with it to see what works for you. Different paint makers find different success doing different things and slightly different things. So I find it helpful to add the paint binder slowly. It stops things being too runny, and it allows me to mix things in and judge how much I might need. Whereas some people just add it all in and chuck it all in together and just start from there. And yeah, it just depends. You just kind of have to experiment and find what works for you. Same with things like mulling time. Some people would mull for longer, some people mull for less. It really just varies on what you like and what you've got time for and how you feel. And as well, another thing that can play a big part, and it's also one of the reasons why I don't give up my paint binder recipe, is that the environment can have a huge impact on characteristics of the paint. So for example, here in the UK we have quite a humid climate, so my paint binder is formulated to survive a more humid climate. Whereas if say someone tried to make my paint binder in a very dry climate, such as, some states in the US, for example, or some of the hotter countries that are out there, they might struggle to get success of it and find my paints a little bit too dry. And then vice versa, someone living in a more humid climate or more cold climate, such as maybe like a Nordic country, would find my paints wouldn't set. So it really does vary on the climate you're in, and it's always best to experiment with where you're making them and everything like that. I do also have a paint dehydrator which helps massively with drying paint. I tend to find we get the most humidity when we have a change of season. So I normally do have to use it around then, or for pigments that are heavily granulating. Some heavily granulating pigments do like to split from the binder as they're drying, so I find it helpful to put them in the dehydrator just to stop the split from happening so much. Right, I'm going to leave you for a moment and you can enjoy some peaceful mulling. and I will catch up with you in a bit when we're going to pour some of this paint into pans. So as you can see, by mulling this for a while, the paint has gotten a lot thicker. It will now kind of hold itself in the middle of the board, whereas before it was sort of running all over the place. So it's a lot thicker now and will hold its own shape a bit more. And now that's done and the paint is ready, we will pour it into some pans. So when I do pans, I tend to pour in very shallow layers. This allows me to basically cram as much paint as I can into the pan, because as paint dries, it will shrink a bit. So each time it will shrink, it will get smaller in the pan, so I can keep putting more and more on the top, which is really great, which means my customers get lots of paint for their buck, which is really good. And as well, it also means I can also detect things such as air bubbles and try and minimise those. And as well, it also gives me an idea of how my pigment to binder ratio is going. If I'm finding the paint is drying too hard, I can add some more binder and a bit more humectant to it. If it's too wet, then it tends to be that I need to add more pigment to the mix, so I can correct it if we're in the early stages. And here we go, I'm just going to pour some pans. And this is also a really messy process. Quite often I will make a mess, and particularly in the later layers, when there's not so much room in the pans, sometimes it will pour over the sides and make a mess. So if you get a pan that's got some stained edges, now you know why. I am pretty clumsy, you can see I've already dropped some paint there. But yeah, this is kind of it. This is sort of some of the process of me making paint. I hope you enjoyed seeing the process and following along, and hopefully you'll now know how I make paint. I do have paint on sale now as well. I've started selling paint again. I'm going to leave my link up in the iCards and in the description as well if you would like to purchase any. I will also leave links as well somewhere to the videos I've already made if you want another look. And as well, I will also try and leave some resources in the description bar as well if you are interested in more about how to make paint, including as well an article on my website which will explain it a little bit as well. But yeah, thanks so much guys for taking the time to watch this. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed making it, and I will see you again in the next video. Ciao.